Hello, business innovators and educators. You're listening to The Enterprise Learning Architect. I'm your host, Chris Knotts, here to guide you through practices and ideas you can use to help build a culture of learning in your organization. Stay tuned to power up your professional playbook as we have conversations with exceptional people who share their experience in achieving successful learning outcomes. Ready to innovate, educate, and iterate? Let's do it. Hello, everyone. This week on the Enterprise Learning Podcast, we have a really interesting discussion with two very insightful young people who share perspectives on the world of Gen Z. Toby Mize, who is, of course, our podcast producer and my sometime co-host here on the pod, and Atticus Finch, a good friend who is just finishing up their senior year at NC State University. Atticus studies software development, AI, and technology services, especially as they intersect with social science and human factors. Toby studies a bit of everything, but also just graduated from NC State University this year, where he finished a degree in esports management. And as an aside, Toby was a young technology co-founder for the successful launch of an app that provided on-demand short tutorials. So very relevant to our learning podcast here, and we'll talk about that in a future episode. But for now, Atticus and Toby share their thoughts on what kind of enablement young people entering the professional workforce at an entry level need to be successful. We talk a bit about where the education system is working and not working, how they see the hiring process, and what's generally on the mind of folks in the Gen Z cohort in their early 20s as they leave school and head into the job market. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too. All right, we're here with Atticus and Toby today, and we're having a conversation about, a few things, I guess. But we've got a few questions here we want to talk about, nothing too structured or anything like that. But I think the thing to know about Atticus and Toby are they are relatively fresh from college and both very smart individuals and keenly interested in your perspective on some of this stuff. And, there's some technology points that we want to cover, and then a couple other points that are relevant to the pod's audience. But we'll see where it goes anyway. So how are y'all?
Doing pretty good.
Doing all right today. Keeping busy.
Yeah, glad to hear it. Same here. Getting through some projects, and that's always nice. But appreciate y'all joining us, and Atticus in particular, thanks for your time. And this is something Toby and I have been excited about. So anyway, let's get into it here. So I've got a little list of questions I sent you in advance, and we'll go through those a little bit. But just to get into the first one here, we had a conversation a week or two ago, kind of exploring different areas we might be able to work together and different areas of interest and things like that. And I thought some of those areas of interest you identified were pretty were pretty noteworthy and worth touching on a little bit. So we talked about your interest in the intersection of technology and social factors, or it might be more accurate to call it sociological factors. You tell me whether it matters which term we use, but I'm interested in that. So tell us some of your favorite musings on that.
Yeah. So first of all, to address that sort of first question, social and sociological, I would say that there is a difference, or they overlap. Their definitions overlap to some extent.
Yep.
So I would say that sociological discussions are social by necessity. But that being said, often you do see social being used to refer to a smaller scope, so a social psychology setting rather than a broader society setting.
Macro, yeah.
Exactly, macro and micro. So the language there is a little loose, and it can even depend on the field. But the point is, I think they're both excellent terms. I think, so for me, really what I look a lot at is I'm very interested in labor generally and understanding the relationship between, not just between workers and managers and within the company, but also understanding the relationship between workers and technology and how workers both need to adapt and can be both hurt and helped by these various technologies we'll be talking about today. I think in terms of just personal interests and musings, I've been recently really fascinated with disaster recovery. We in North Carolina had a terrible, terrible hurricane in Florida as well, and I recently got the chance to do some research and writing on the use of drones and UAVs for that application. And I've just been really impressed, impressed with how much innovation we're seeing in that area. And that connects to all sorts of important issues, artificial intelligence, engineering, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, what what interests me so much about it is its ability not just to help people, but to build systems that will be able to consistently help people, which is of course different. Um, yeah, I'd say that's generally where my focus lies. I'm very interested in finding solutions for problems that affect everyone. And in a world, so in our world, so much is changing, especially with technology, that I think oftentimes we underestimate how many people are going to be affected by these things. So yeah, just there's a lot to look at. I prefer to work with case studies. Generally, that's why I brought up the Helene. That's sort of my discipline's background, is we tend to work a lot with examples and case studies and research topics. But as a more broad, just to close out, as a more broad comment, I do think that we live in a super important and exciting time for technology. I think that the belief that technology is slowing down or that we are stagnating is somewhat silly. I think that there are serious challenges into the technology world, but we are still making astounding progress and and more importantly, we are saving lives and building lives with technology, and that's what interests me.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a great call out and a good way to describe it. You mentioned something interesting, and I'll just throw this out there for our listeners. You mentioned the disaster recovery thing and how that can be used to build, I guess, what you might call resilient systems, or that's what I'd call it, right? It's this interesting adjacency to some of the work that we've done here, and in particular to my work, in which we've built a lot of learning and training around the professional IT movement known as DevOps. I don't know if you've heard of this DevOps, right? So, but it's been a big part of my career, and they're always borrowing from previous systems thinking paradigms, which is I think super cool. I love that. It's kind of like the Mark Twain history rhyme type of thing. But there was a fellow early in the DevOps professional movement, grassroots, and his name was Jesse Robbins. So Jesse Robbins founded an org called Ops Code, worked for Chef for a while, and all kinds of other interesting jobs. But Jesse had I don't know if you'd call it moonlight or whatever, but Jesse was obviously like a really influential kind of entrepreneurial IT professional, but also was a firefighter. And so he brought this whole sort of crisis management, emergency response type lens to production enterprise IT, and was basically exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I think the life-saving aspect and the sort of like the humanitarian aspect, I'm not sure that was quite as central, because it was oriented around maintaining enterprise IT infrastructure and things like that. Although there's more touches on livelihood and humanitarian issues when it comes to enterprise IT environments than some people might think, and I think it's getting more all the time. So anyway, but when you think about systems resiliency and responding to security incidents and just things breaking in general, even if it's not like a mission critical outage, but a business critical outage or something like that. It's like there's, once again, just like with lean or Toyota production or something, there's a whole kind of playbook there from an already very established and mature area. Like people have been thinking hard about and building really sophisticated, well-designed templates and iterating and improving on templates for crisis management for a long time. And so there's like a lot of principles there that can be applied to enterprise IT. Anyway, Jesse Robbins, super cool and influential guy. He was kind of like a thought leader who influenced the DevOps thought leaders in that way. So a little random, but you just reminded me of that. But I couldn't agree
No, I think
more
it's
as well.
absolutely relevant.
Yeah. Couldn't agree
I was
more
just
about
gonna say, like,
Yep.
I was just gonna say real quick, like, totally, I think enterprise IT is, and building resilient systems in enterprise IT in our modern world, that is life saving. And I think we need to acknowledge that. I'm not saying that you weren't, but I think it's important that we say that specifically, because we live in a world where so many of our day-to-day systems, healthcare especially is the obvious example. Healthcare and everything from organizing shifts to the machines that keep people alive right there. Building that into a resilient, considerate system, that's enterprise IT, and that is critical to people's well-being. And even in situations where it's not directly tying to someone's health, the reality is when businesses fail, workers suffer. And we need to acknowledge that when we're building these resilient systems and when we're prioritizing resilience, a big part of that is because we want to build our enterprise, our firm, into a system that is going to be sustainable and reliable, and the employees are going to feel like they are considered at the very least, because employees are obviously very important. They are labor, they are how you make, they are how you produce. So I think acknowledging that enterprise IT and building that out resiliently, a big part of that is for the workers in the company, right? And building that long-term survivable project. Yeah.
Yeah, well said. Couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Toby, anything to add?
Um, I think it's really good to focus on building future forward resiliency, but I'd also really like to kind of talk about how so many enterprise systems right now, especially in the government, are built on old and outdated and difficult to work on systems that use languages that people don't know anymore, and the difficulty of both maintaining those so that they don't fail and also upgrading them without, losing critical infrastructure in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean we could do a series of conversations on that exact issue, and I can tell you as somebody who's worked with a lot of um, existing enterprise IT teams, I mean, enterprise by its nature suggests a certain level of scale, right? So like you don't no organization just springs forth from the womb fully formed as a 50,000 or 100,000 person organization, right? It takes time to get there. And so when it takes time to get there, you have a bunch of entrenched legacy stuff. And this is something I've done tons of work in this area because so many of the dysfunctions that are actually baked into the systems are a result of exactly what you're talking about, Toby. At all levels, right? Like software, hardware, and people as well as like behavior patterns that have grown up around the necessity of how you handle something where you've got a piece of 30-year-old infrastructure or software, but it's still like business critical. You can't unplug it. They talk about this in the Phoenix Project, if anybody's ever read that. But like, the idea that this is this horrible, old, mysterious, sometimes just like a black box piece. Like it's that legacy, 30 years old. Nobody really knows how it works. It's written in some obsolete language, and I had a client that had this was a large government agency, by the way, whom I will not name here, but it was very interesting. But they had a piece of software in their stack that they'd gotten to the point where there was like one guy in the world who could repair it when something went wrong. And so when something went wrong, they had to fly this guy over from Germany, whence he would get paid $10,000 an hour to work on this thing. So that's pretty painful, obviously. Like there's a lot of expense there, and refactoring that would obviously save a lot of money, but it just proves to be really, really hard. So you hear teams talk about rebuilding their airplane while it's in the air and things like that, and we could get into a more specific conversation about refactoring these environments and microservices and things like that. And there are solutions out there, again, the folks in the DevOps community have a lot to say about this, the strangler pattern and things like that. But anyway, Toby, I think that's a great topic, and it's really interesting. I think it's really interesting that you two are identifying some of these issues, given where you are, to be candid, like early in your career, because they are very much hot topics of conversation, topics that, middle-aged, high-level IT directors and things like that are trying to cope with. So all that to say, it's really relevant. And there are some solutions out there, but I mean, Toby, you brought it up from your point of view. You're not maybe as biased by working with some of the existing customers that I've encountered. But what's your 2 cents on that? Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that would be Toby. Yeah,
okay. I think that it's very interesting coming up in a world where the technology has changed so quickly that there are many people who are feeling left behind in the older generation, and simultaneously in the younger generation, have come up where technology has been so easy and so accessible and so omnipresent that they never really even thought about how it got there and like the difficulties in dealing with it. The so-called quote unquote iPad kids, they've never really had to troubleshoot anything. And so there's this really interesting middle gap of younger Gen X and all of millennial and older Gen Z that have kind of been privy to this rise of rapid change and have been able to adapt and to think and to learn how to troubleshoot difficult technological things and understand how to adapt and how to learn on the fly. And I think that being sort of on the very far end of that, where I wouldn't say that I'm technically illiterate in any means, but I definitely don't have the same sort of understanding on a deep fundamental level that somebody like Atticus does, or that these older people, this person that gets flown out from Germany for $10,000 an hour has. And I think it is going to really start to show itself. I mean, it kind of already has. We talked about this in a previous episode about how all the nuclear engineers are dying out, right? Yeah. There's nobody to replace them. There's going to be this passing period of technological knowledge and technical workers that won't exist. And surely there will be something to replace them. But I think it's going to be very difficult in the interim to understand how that's going to impact our business functions and our government's functions.
Yeah, for sure. So like you're getting into one of the main things I wanted to talk to y'all about, right? Exactly. So, this is a podcast that's about learning specifically in business settings, and usually in very large enterprise settings. So I'm obviously, as I mentioned to you guys before we got on, I'm particularly interested in y'all's points of view, as people who are, I guess, I don't know, what would you call yourself? Older Gen Z? Is that accurate?
Yeah. We're actually more like straight of middle of the pack Gen Z. At least I am.
Middle of the pack. Okay.
I'm not quite a Zennial. I know this because I know some Zennials, and I'm not
You're
them.
Definitely not them. Okay, so middle of the road Gen Z. So that's perfect, right? So people who are in my network and the type of markets that I'm trying to sell services to, I think they're going to be really keen to find some source around middle of the road Gen Z points of view. So I'm interested in like giving you guys a little bit of a platform for that. So, and being very candid, people want to hear about that. People who are in middle management, senior management, functional directors. I mean, these are people who've been in the high-tech workforce for 30 years. So, although maybe still relying on when it comes to software engineers or something, maybe younger cohorts. But anyway, so we're really interested in y'all's perspective here. So I think the question I had here just broadly is what do folks in your generation need to move into the professional world? This is a journey y'all are at the very beginning of. So I want to hear from both of you guys.
Yeah, so really quickly, because I think I can connect these things, I did want to say that just to follow up on what Toby said just before, this is a really big issue that we're seeing, and it's going to be a really big issue, especially for me and Toby's generation dealing with younger people, is that there's this assumption of literacy that isn't really there, and I don't know if there's any like one force responsible for this. I think that obviously like parents and teachers and school systems and people who design curriculums have some level of responsibility. But the reality is right now, a lot of kids are not getting the digital literacy education they need. And we should expect, even as they come up through college, that they might still have struggles around that. As an example, I have about half of what I have done at NC State is in computer science, roughly. And I am not a computer science major, but I know a lot of them. And I have noticed this serious reoccurring problem, talking with them, especially about getting jobs, internships. And that is a lot of them, they can write the code. They can put it down on the paper. They understand the computer science fundamentals. They don't lack a technical knowledge of the theoretical, but they really struggle to engage with an actual business IT environment, which you wouldn't expect from someone who has programmed so much and has so much time. but a lot of them aren't actually super in tune with the sort of graphical front end UI and using software side of things. And we specifically at State, there's a problem in my opinion, and I've spoken with senior professors about this there, that we don't really teach the part of programming much that is the interface between the person and the code. That's a big skill lack in terms of the engineers we're sending out into the world. And I think it reflects this.
You talking about like UX and user centricity, that kind of thing?
Yes, but the point I'm trying to make is more that I think what we're going to be realizing with this new generation of engineers, and what people have already been realizing, and I have heard from tech managers that I've spoken with. I'll be headed to All Things Open next week to talk with people in Raleigh. But from talking with tech managers, it's a consistent problem that the connection between the client, or alternatively, the connection between the programmer as a user in the IT environment, there's a weakness to that connection. So I think that's a skill that not only would it be good to supplement as you are onboarding a new engineer, is to make sure, check those boxes, make sure they understand the software they're working with, make sure that they actually know what's going on, and provide them the proper training, because the truth is there's so many different little tools out there that no one can know all of them. And further, just that I think in the technology industry, we need to be pushing for a more holistic education generally for most engineers. I think we often leave out a lot of the most important things that managers really want to see in their candidates, honestly. And I'm not sure if this is who's going to solve this problem exactly, but I think that from the perspective of the industry, we should be expecting, as a result of these failures in the system, to be dealing with a generation of engineers that are not going to be as proficient in that way. And as Toby said, they didn't grow up having to deal with complicated like file systems. They didn't grow up fixing printers. They had their iPad. They had the app. They clicked it. The UI was clean. It was simple. It did exactly what you wanted. It never broke. And that's true of a lot of the environments we program in now too. But with the moment you start taking multi-environment systems, that breaks down. And I really think that multi-environment, that multi-tool system is a really big struggle for a lot of engineers that I've worked with.
So this is a very fascinating to me, and it's obviously could not be more central to why I have this podcast, right? Because there's a skills gap dimension there. There's obviously like what do employers need their people to be able to do? I mean, that is a skills gap, but I mean there's a very important dimension there around like being able to do what the organization needs to do, not just what you need your people to be able to have the skills to do. Anyway, so, like identifying pain points and problems and gaps like that is exactly what I'm into here. So I love that you've framed it up so well. But I mean, it is a hard problem. I mean, there's a generational thing going on. There's some systems failures maybe around like the overall education system or whatever. But at the end of the day, right, like people who are hiring or businesses who are trying to do something, like it is what it is, right? Like this is the landscape that we have to deal with. So I mean, let's just think about it for a minute in terms of ideation for solutions. I mean, especially if let's say you've got, so let's just set the stage, right? So let's say we've got kind of the condition that you're describing, Atticus. We've got obviously really smart, motivated graduates coming out. And they have some competencies very well covered in terms of comp sci or whatever, but there's these gaps, right? So there's still going to be an appetite to hire those people, but I mean, I can tell you organizations are willing to invest in filling the gaps. So what might that look like that from y'all's point of view? That's what I'm really interested in. What are the gaps? What might solutions look like? I mean, are there things that are just too gnarly even to solve for, especially given that the time for embarking on a 4-year course of full-time education at that point is over, right? Like employers have to figure out how to shoehorn in the learning and the upskilling as they're also trying to get productivity out of the hires. So you get what I'm saying, right? So just riff on that for a minute for me.
Yeah, I think so. I currently work in a engineering environment, actually doing full stack web development, or as an assistant to full stack web development. And recently, I've actually been helping out with some new employees doing the same job as me, just like working with them. I think that for one, I think we really need to remember the value of placing just the simple act of giving a new employee a person they can just always ask questions. They don't need to be just having a touchdown person, and that probably shouldn't always necessarily be their manager, but that's fine because they obviously are very busy and have stuff to do. But having someone with a similar skill set that they can work alongside at the start, someone they can work with and get guidance from, even if it's not so much instructional as it is watch and do with me. I think that goes a long way, and it really helped me. And it's, in my experience, been very helpful for younger engineers to have that. I would also say, I mean, the reality is, since I've worked in various IT and programming environments consistently, and obviously this is an issue of it's a relative issue, but I have never had a onboarding process with updated documentation with mod where I didn't have to go and troubleshoot a million things that were no longer updated. So just making sure at the very end of the day, just having someone making sure that your onboarding process is actually up to date, because technology changes all the time, especially in the development world. And I do remember quite explicitly following some very specific instructions for environment setup, and it just didn't work. And I had to get my manager, which takes away their value, their time. Whereas if the documentation had just been right, it wouldn't have been a problem. So just making sure we have up-to-date documentation, making sure employees have not necessarily bosses, but peers they can go to learn and develop and get better. Not isolating employees in terms of their duties. For example, engineers especially, we in our environment, we always practice not necessarily pair programming because that reduces productivity, but at the very least, you're in the room with someone or in the Zoom with someone, and you can, if you need help or if you need another eye, you can wait for them to come to a pause point and they can come give a look. You don't need to be doing the same thing, but just having someone who has the flexibility and availability and vice versa to support each other, I think that goes a really long way in terms of making engineers feel confident. And I do think that is a big issue, is I think that a lot of people don't feel confident to take the initiative when they come into a new place to actually do their job, right? So making sure that employees, I mean, first of all, they're going to make mistakes when they show up, probably. And making sure that the system can, obviously there are some mistakes that are terrible, but for the most part, making sure that that system actually teaches them something when they fail rather than just punishing them when they fail. I think that that goes a long way and I'm unsure how much of what I've just said is already standard exact policy in enterprise environments. But I think that from my experience, mostly in the public enterprise, like large enterprise public sector, these have all been consistently issues in various departments and firms.
Yeah, I mean, hey, man, what can I say? Preach. Um, you are spot on. And I mean, I can answer the question about SOP and how much is standard. I guess what I can tell you is that there's a very healthy and a fairly well established and I think a growing, trending community of practice out there in enterprise IT that essentially is exactly everything you just described, right? Like acknowledging that those are the issues, and essentially the solution you described is exactly, I think, there's obviously different components and aspects, but like in large, like you just described from a high level point of view, the solution concept, and that is like that's out there, and there's advocacy for that. But is it actually practiced? No, usually not. And again, because of legacy factors and momentum issues and things like that. But I think also just because of the very often the like profit cycle motive that we deal with. There's this crunch that skews incentivization towards short term, and I'm sure like down with this, and I'm not telling you anything new, but there are very powerful factors that like crunch the incentives towards short-term thinking. And short-term thinking is essentially the fundamental enemy of everything you just described, right? Like you've got to invest in longer-term success cycles in order to do what you're talking about. And then just as a, to throw out like another point from my own past, what you described in terms of sort of the very entrenched, integrated, cross-mentoring type of patterns that you described, right? Where it's like so you talked about documentation. So maybe there's a body of knowledge there that is maintained. Of course, it's like, it doesn't really work though if you just have sort of one or two people who own the maintaining of it. It has to be kind of a collective responsibility. Everybody has to be bought into this ethos of there's a body of lessons and knowledge there, and it's everybody's responsibility to kind of contribute to it and capture the lessons from the failures and things like that. That's also very DevOps-ish, I'd say. But anyhow, another of these past historical rhyming patterns is basically I did a lot of research a while back on Toyota, which I mentioned, and of course Americans have researched Toyota out the yin yang to varying degrees of success. But there's a guy, Mike Rother, who wrote a really interesting book called Toyota Kata, and he describes in there how like back in the probably like late 70s, early 80s, when Japan was kicking the ass of all of the American car manufacturers in terms of quality, then of course all the American automotive management got really interested in like what they were doing. How can they do this? How do they get such high levels of quality, and how can we replicate it? And so he describes in this book how these consultants would go over there, and they would expect Toyota to kind of be very closed and guarded about their processes and things like that. But actually they were very open about it. They were like, oh yeah, come on in and see, let us show you. And they would show everything, and they were fine about it. And there was a question at one point of, if you have such distinguished processes that deliver such a superior product, then why are you so open about sharing this stuff? Like, shouldn't these be industry secrets or whatever? And the Toyota management's response was basically like, you can feel free to take this stuff and copy it. By the time you implement what you're seeing here, we will have moved on. Because we have such adaptive evolutionary management is such a part. Then that was their secret sauce, right? It wasn't actually the process and the documentation that they were willing to share. It was the fact that they had built into their culture the ability to keep up and like continuously improve in a way that just delivered like way superior levels of quality. I mean, getting really into the the 99th, or that's like 6 sigma percentile or whatever. So anyway, I thought that was very interesting. But like, so then Mike Rother in this book, he continues to try to probe and penetrate about like, well, how did they do this? And so it turned out like they didn't really have a this is, I think, a very American way of thinking. Like, oh, what's the process manual? What's the big, thick playbook that you follow to make this work? What's the process you've engineered? And really, like, they hadn't really actually engineered all that much. But they had instituted a culture essentially of mentoring, and that was what it was, right? And it was at any given time, everybody in Toyota, no matter how junior or how senior they were, they both had as part of their job mentoring and being a mentee, right? So it was like everybody was both mentoring and getting mentorship, and that's what you said reminded me of, And I think, and so like in American IT, there's, especially like in the DevOps and the lean IT management community, there is and there's practices and processes associated with this stuff too, by the way, right? Like, it's not just philosophical, and that's there, and it's there for the taking, and always happy to talk about that with anybody who wants to, but it can prove very tough to implement just from like internal political, I mean, you know what I mean? Like you can do the math, right? And imagine how sacrifices are made and short-term incentives are prioritized when there's like a quarterly cycle there that ultimately has to do with like stock buybacks and stuff like that. You can't really invest in like the incremental continuous improvement over 2 years that you would need to actually deliver something that at the end of that 2 years would be truly transformative in terms of what your people could produce. But yeah, just can't get there from here a lot of times.
I think that raises a really good point, Chris. And I think, the value of mentorship is one of humans' greatest powers and boons. And I kind of wanted to connect that back to, Gen Z and beyond in the workplace. Because, since forever, the mentors of the world have been saying, this new generation is cooked. Plato famously was pissed that everybody had books now. Like we should just be able to memorize the knowledge. You shouldn't be able to just have it written down. That's unfair. And I think, almost always it's mostly just old people being grumpy, right? And forgetting that they did stupid things when they were kids, and that a generation has to learn before they're smart. But we're seeing a lot of reports coming out about Gen Z workers being fired at really high rates, and obviously some of that is going to be due to the fact that especially in the tech market, things are really hard right now. Layoffs are high, and the first people to go are going to be the people who are newest. But also, we're seeing hiring managers and upper level workers saying that the Gen Z people have no work ethic, that they're unable to complete basic tasks and some of these things. And I, as always, I'm just very interested in seeing what of that is simply curmudgeoning and what of that is true. Like what COVID did to our education and our work ethic and our society has done to our ability to be good employees right out of college.
I mean, I think that it's a great point, right? So we were just talking about this the other day, in terms of the firing rate or the hiring gap for that age group, and depending on who you ask, you hear from a Gen Zer, oh, it's so tough, and where it's our cohort is having a hard time getting the numbers where they need to be in terms of hiring. It's so hard to get a job and things like that. But yeah, then if you ask like existing organizations, you hear a lot about kind of like, well, they have no clue about being on time or even coming in to work at all, or like the importance of co-location or showing up. I think as with most things, it's not an either or, right? Like there's actually some truth to both perspectives, and I think that people in older generations, definitely some of them at least, can get a little curmudgeon-y. I actually think that the young people can get a little curmudgeon-y. I don't think being curmudgeon-y is actually exclusive to a particular age group. I think that, and I've thought a lot about this because when I was first getting into this kind of a space, it was pre-Gen Z, but it was very much like the same conversation was being had from millennials, and there was a lot of the same chatter, right? So like here I'm like an Xer, and I was listening to people in a slight like boomer level management complaining about millennials basically, and it wasn't all the same exact things, but it was like a one generation earlier version of the same things. There was definitely a lot of complaints about the attention span and entitlement issues and things like that. And one of the things I noticed there was basically just that. The common denominator I saw was that seemed like there was a lack of empathy on both sides, right? And basically, somebody who's a 55-year-old director, they can get curmudgeon-y and complain about, the short attention span or the lack of work ethic or the entitlement or whatever. But there's also, there's like a failure to be curious about the underlying root causes for how those behaviors may be. And the fact that like the millennials are having an experience here, and the Gen Zers are having an experience. But then on the flip side, right, like I would often see, I would see a lot of like dismissive attitudes on the part of the millennials for the older people, and like not they just had no understanding about like the incentives and the responsibilities that age group had, in the fact that like at the end of the day they're both usually having fairly honest intentions, right? Like there's not any malintent there, but I just always felt like the corollary of that lack of empathy was that if they could develop that empathy, like both generations actually had a lot of valuable perspective to offer the other, right? Like a lot of the stuff that the millennials or in our case maybe the Zers, some of the things, Atticus, like you were talking about, that maybe they lack, that mentoring or that availability, like the older generations actually, they could help with that, right? But there's also areas where the older generation could use some help, and the younger generation has perspective coming up that could help with. So I don't know. I guess it basically just boils down to exactly what you're saying, Atticus. Like figure out how to cross pollinate the knowledge and the perspective. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on that.
I don't know, it's quite wise. I would say that's worth at least 3 or 4 cents.
Oh man, that's so generous.
Okay.
I'm biting my tongue about inflation right now. So cool. So this is exactly the conversation I was wanting to have, and we've been going for a bit, right? So I'd say, 5-10 minutes. I want to mostly hear from you guys for the remainder. And I guess so, going down my list of questions here, you started touching on some of the things that I think there's a real appetite for learning more about in terms of the intergenerational stuff, and especially how it relates to upskilling and finding your place in the workforce. But let me just ask y'all, both of you, so how are people in your middle of the road Z cohort feeling about the working world? I mean, you just shared some of like editorial positioning about the generation in general, but what about y'all? How are you thinking about the work world, and just the world in general? Atticus, maybe you go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for me personally because to some extent, I just feel lucky, honestly, to a large point. Not to say that I don't have skill or that I don't have talent. I definitely feel like I bring a lot of genuine like usefulness to the table. I just also recognize that like I was directly able to get to where I am as a result of what I had, and I think that a lot of people in my generation aren't quite as lucky. And the reason I mention this is even these engineers coming out of school, they don't have the luxury I have, the same luxuries I have, where my parents are able to support me to some extent, even as I'm finishing up my last little bit of school and leaving. There's an amount of a cushion. I think a lot of engineers are scared of not the long term. I think a lot of these people are genuinely hopeful for the long term that I talk to. They're excited about their subject of research. They're excited about it changing the world. They're excited about building successful products, but they're terrified of that starting point. I think really the getting started, and this is, I think, a broad trend in my generation, is that a lot of us are just very, very talented. I think we have a lot of talent, a lot to offer the world, but I think there's a general struggle with that getting started, and there's a fear of, I think to some extent, there's a genuine fear as a result of recent trends in terms of hiring, that it's not going to work out, that they're not going to get discovered, they're not going to get cared about, there's not going to be a mentor that's going to bring them up into a company where they're going to be able to have a successful career and be successful for that company. And we can talk about the details of if that's true or not and how true that is, but I can't change that. I think what I'm more interested in is how do we bridge that gap? How do we do that outreach? How do we find the people who don't just have the highest GPA, who don't just have but who actually have that passion and that interest, because that's a separate issue. One thing I've noticed in recent years that companies have been doing here at State, is that at career fairs, very little is actually done in the way of establishing like a conversation. And part of this is that there's so many workers that want the job. There's so many people showing up and it's hard. But I think that as the career fair becomes less viable as a way to connect, or as similar systems, we need to examine how we're building these connections between the people who are actually passionate about what they're working on and the people who want to take that passion about what they're working on and help them change the world. And I think we have a serious break there in that point. I think the post-college time really is the biggest disconnect for my generation and the biggest fear for my generation. And to some extent, me. I mean, again, I said I'm very lucky, and it's true. I have many opportunities I'm pursuing right now. I'm applying to grad school. I'm looking for business I'm able to have all these choices. But most people, they may have a few choices. They may have an internship they got that has a connection. They may have, and I think that more, if we want to have a tech firm with successful and passionate talent and a good team, we have to do there might need to be more done to actually go out and get them, and recognizing it's more than just here's a QR code, go fill out our application, because you're not going to be able to translate that passion into an application always. Some students can, and those are the people who get hired and then are successful. But a lot of students go to their career center, have someone help them write their resume, and sure, they have a 3.9 GPA, but they have no actual business. They don't have these kinds of skills. So if we want to connect the passionate and strong engineers, if we want to reconnect, I should say, because I think this is a problem that was much less true in previous generations, and there were much better systems, and there were just a lot less people, right, trying to access these resources at one place, because now with the internet, we can access everything everywhere. I can apply to a job in Seattle. I can apply to a job over here. You're now competing with
else.
Exactly. You're not competing with, I guess my point is, your workers are competing with so many people, and we need to make sure we're finding the right people. And to me, that's the gap we have to bridge if we want to make that
not
go away.
only are now we, because even you could apply to a job in Seattle 10 years ago pretty easily, but now you can use an AI program that will tailor your resume to the job in Seattle and apply to 1,000 jobs a day, and everyone can apply to 1,000 jobs a day. And so what are the recruiters going to do? They can't handle that. They're going to use AI to sift through those jobs, and now we just have AI pretending to be a person and AI pretending to be a recruiter, and they're jamming each other together trying to find a fit, and it's never going to happen.
That's exactly right. I think that is right on the money, and I think that's something I've been thinking about here recently, just because, I mean, it is so recent, right? Obviously, everybody has access to a generative AI tool. I mean, the HR departments were already using like algorithmic screening and stuff even before ChatGPT. So now it's all on steroids. And I don't know. To me, I don't know how it seems to y'all, but to me, it just starts to look and feel like a giant, massive morass of swirling whatever, that's impossible to penetrate. And it's like that to me is, if I were to think about being a new entrant, to the enterprise job market, that I think would feel very terrifying, right? Because it's like, where do you even find a meaningful connection, a chink in all of the noise, that you can get through?
It's the same as it's always been. You have to have previous connections. It's just they've become ever so more important.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I think that there's a common line here, which is that people are getting how do I explain this right? This system is failing, right? This current system of hiring, I think, is failing, and I think people really want to do competitive hiring, and I get it. And I think it's appropriate in some circumstances. Obviously, I'm not telling anyone to not do it. But I think that people need to be examining methods of hiring that are not as based on competition, because the reality is when everyone can compete, which is the world we now live in, there's just no way to effectively, right? Even if we're just thinking about the return here on the quality of the candidate, it's very hard to effectively assess, especially with the fact that these days it seems like lying on resumes is rampant. And I won't comment on that either way, but the reality is when you're screening all these resumes, you don't even, half the time it's not true, right? You're going to get a big stack of resumes that are embellished, which is not to say that, and from the student's perspective or from the employee's perspective, I understand it to some extent, but I guess what I'm pointing out here is this competitive system of hiring is breaking down, which is only leaving the connections method of hiring. And I think that's not necessarily inherently terrible, but we need to build equitable systems that actually can bring more people to the table on that. Because it's great for me. I'm passionate. I'm interested. And I have access to these spaces, and I'm lucky enough to know have parents who went through this and went through these systems and can guide me through it. But a lot of people, they are passionate, they are talented, they just didn't have that in their life. And you can't make that connection. So I think it's not necessarily bad that we're losing. I mean, we have to adapt, right? It's not necessarily bad that this competitive mode of hiring is starting to fail, because it was, I think, kind of inevitable. I just think we need to be really thinking proactively about how we can bridge that connection going forward in a world where you're going to get a million applicants if you put an application online, right? And I'm not sure exactly what the solution is there. I have some ideas. I think that building better connections with universities would be really, as an example, would be great. And there are companies that have done that, and I think they've actually been quite successful as a result of it. Here on, like on NC State's campus, for example, we have a number of very large enterprise companies that have campuses there where they directly hire interns on campus, and it's been very successful in terms of facilitating bringing talent to, for example, firms like Cisco hires very directly and very successfully from NC State because they did the work to show up and build that connection in the system here and make a path for students who maybe otherwise they wouldn't have been able to make that connection. So I guess my point is observing these future models and sort of building these new systems to replace, because we're going to have to.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Also, couldn't agree more.
I'll throw out one example just because I think what you're saying, Atticus, is true, right? Like, and I mean, there's some interesting aspects to it, but I was involved in a project a while ago in which our client was it was a large investment bank, bank that you would have heard of, right? And that has a strong headquarters presence here in the Triangle, and they had a very well-established program. And you can find information about this program. I guess to play it safe, I won't mention it by name. But essentially, they had a program in which they had partnerships with universities, a number of universities, and then they would go in and recruit mostly comp sci majors, but they would recruit pre-graduation, and then it was fairly selective, obviously, but great opportunity, and they recruited. Like pretty sizable cohorts, a couple hundred at a time. And these were always for enterprise tech roles. I was involved in designing the track for the data engineering track, but they also had business analyst track, software development track, also a mainframe track, interestingly. Anyway, so, and then they would come in and they would intensively train these new recruits and provide them housing, right? So like when they were out of school, they would come down, the bank would provide them housing for 6 weeks while they went through this training. Very different from like collegiate training. It's like on the job, enterprise training, real world. And then an additional 6 weeks of like what would you call it, like journey person, on the job project-based training where they actually work on project. So 12 weeks pretty intensively, all the time, which like their room and board was covered and things like that. And so you can imagine it's like quite expensive for the employer because it's 3 months and all of this cost, as well as all the upfront cost of the recruiting efforts and all that, but like before they actually had productive employees coming online. But that program was viewed across the entire company as being like one of the flagship like crown jewels of their HR management process, because the professionals that then got integrated were so successful and capable, and it was like uniformly lauded, and they're growing that program all the time. And then they do it internationally, and then all of their other HQ locations, they do that. So I guess I'm just here to say, right, like that was the ROI of that program was indisputable there. It was very widely acknowledged, and that was pretty cool. So anyway, there are, like you're saying, I mean, there are programs and solutions out there, and there's playbooks for that stuff. But I do think that the programs like that were more the exception than the rule, in my view, I guess. But anyway, well, hey, guys, thanks y'all for doing this. This is the exact conversation I was hoping for, and I think there's probably all kinds of other cool things we could talk about. I'd love to have you back, but I'll give you guys the last word. Atticus, what else? What other nuggets do you have for us before we draw to a close here?
I've talked a lot, but I will try it. I'll keep this quick. I just want to say that like I think the most important thing generally that people I think have lost sight of is that, or the problem is that labor, I do think people have really lost sight of like the actual real dynamics of labor. I think we often don't think about it. This isn't necessary. I'm not casting any sort of bad intention, but I often think we think about employees as machines. And the problem with that is that they're much, much less reliable than machines. And I don't mean that in the
That's one
sense of
them.
like, right, and I don't mean that in the sense of their work. I mean that like we need to recognize in general that there are a lot of different kinds of people that could be really successful and awesome, and acknowledging that in our world, which is, in my opinion, getting very much more diverse in many ways in terms of there's a lot more paths. Like, for example, my path, you would never have heard of something like an STS program, half comps. You never would have heard of something like this typically. And I think just recognizing that the world is getting more, there's just going to be more uniqueness in that way, and that we need to build systems that can actually recognize that unique talent rather than just filtering through a data set. I think it's just got to be more complicated. And it's hard. It's a hard like pill to swallow, but I think we're just going to have to accept that if we want to do successful hiring and we want to successfully bring on young people, it's just going to be a little more complicated.
I couldn't agree more. I actually don't think it's that hard to accept, right? Because I think in general, in the business world, it's fairly well acknowledged that you have this concept of like a VUCA, right? Like complexity is always increasing. Excuse me. Unpredictability is always increasing. But if you think about if things really are simultaneously always getting more complex while also changing, then it just follows that you're basically things are going to get more and more specialized, right? Like whereas yesterday there was 100 specializations and now today there's 1,000,000 specializations or whatever. So that's interesting, right? Because I think it also means that there's a place for the unique human attributes. Because if you think about people as machines, then that's a failing philosophy, right? Because we actually are having more and more incredible machines come online. So actually, the thing that is really machines are machines, and machines are really good at doing what machines do. But the more that things that humans were doing that now a machine can do, and probably better, right? Machines more reliable, they can operate at scale, less prone to error in some ways, and stuff like that. Like get the boring commoditized work out of the hands of the humans and like make the machines do that, right? Like just like they did in factories, and then but the also kind of like just basic supply and demand from an economic standpoint, the things that humans can do that machines can't do, of which there still continues to be a lot, although it can take work to stay on top of actually what those things are. But they're, at least in the midterm, there's still plenty of human attributes that are not going to be able to be replicated by machines. And those things get more valuable, right? So like I feel like for people who are in charge of hiring or sourcing workers and employees, it's important to understand those things, because if you do, you actually have the right economic lens to stay on top of where these things are going, and it also helps the people, because like if a person has a machine that can do something boring that they don't actually really enjoy doing, and now they can be relied on for the thing that's actually more valuable, then to me, I don't know, that's my jam. I think that that's a winning rhythm for a future facing system. And I don't actually think it's that hard to understand. I think it's pretty logical. So hopefully that tenet gets adopted. But I also think when you talk about people as machines or whatever, I think at the end of the day it's really a conversation about value, and that's definitely something that's very present in the business world. People are thinking more and more about value. What's the source of the value? What's the value stream? How do we turn the value into money and things like that? And so, you just have to understand like where are the value creation centers? Like machines can produce value and humans can produce value, and there's equity available there if somebody cares to to do the work. Anyway, Toby, what you got for us?
I only have one final message for everybody listening and everyone here. Get out and vote.
Oh yeah,
It's
please.
a hard change, but please go vote.
No, that's a great one. Yeah, it's October 25th. We have like 9 days, I guess. So yeah, North Carolina early voting is open. So go vote, please. Couldn't say it enough.
You'd be surprised of how much we talked about is actually affected by government policy that's on the line.
That's why I said it.
Go vote.
Couldn't agree more. Atticus, Toby, I'm not sure you guys are exactly your typical Even though I'm kind of a middle of the road
What?
Gen Zer, but I do think it's a real privilege to have access to y'all's minds and to y'all's points of view, and just really appreciate the time, and I hope we can do it again.
Absolutely.
100%.
Thank you so
I
much for
can't
having
wait
me
to
on.
have more episodes.
Yep, coming soon. Thanks, guys.
All right. Have a great one, y'all.